Okay, picture this for a moment. For decades, Canada occupied a position in American strategy that was never supposed to be questioned, not just an ally, not just a trading partner, a constant so deeply embedded in U.S. supply chain security planning and political trust that the relationship faded into the background, stable, assumed, permanent, until Donald Trump put a number on it, a 100% tariff aimed not at a rival, not at an adversary, but at one of America's closest allies. That single threat reframed the relationship overnight. Cooperation turned into confrontation. Certainty turned into calculation. This wasn't a routine trade dispute buried in legal language or handled quietly behind closed doors. A tariff at this scale is a warning shot. It forces markets to react, governments to reassess, and allies to question assumptions they've relied on for generations. When Donald Trump treats an ally like a target, the message doesn't stop at the Canadian border. It travels fast. It tells the world that no partnership is untouchable and no economic relationship is guaranteed. The justifications sound familiar: supply chains, competitiveness, strategic leverage. But the scale changes everything. Is this really about protecting American industry? Is it a sideways move in a larger confrontation with China? Or is it something more basic, a reminder that in today's global order, economic tools are no longer neutral? Under Donald Trump, they're instruments of power. This isn't just a headline, it's a signal. And to understand what it actually means, we have to step away from the rhetoric and look at the deeper shift now reshaping global trade alliances and power itself. The shock statement, what Donald Trump actually threatened. The shock wasn't just what was threatened, it was how Donald Trump delivered it. This wasn't careful language filtered through diplomats or buried inside policy briefings. It was blunt, public, deliberately confrontational. A 100% tariff wasn't framed as a negotiating tool. Donald Trump floated it as a warning, less an opening bid, more a line drawn in the sand. And then came the language. Canada wasn't described by Donald Trump as a partner navigating complex supply chains. It was recast publicly as a drop-off port for China, a phrase loaded with accusation and suspicion. Even more striking was Donald Trump's use of the word governor, language reserved for domestic authority, not for sovereign allies. Words matter in geopolitics, and these words weren't accidental. They reframed Canada's status subtly but unmistakably from partner to subordinate. What made the moment even more destabilizing was the timing. Just weeks earlier, in January, Canada's engagement with China had been tolerated, even encouraged. Yet Donald Trump offered no policy review, no formal announcement, no explanation for the reversal. The shift appeared sudden, and that uncertainty became part of the signal. Most importantly, Donald Trump left the rules undefined. What qualifies as an acceptable deal? What behavior removes the risk? And what triggers punishment? That vagueness isn't a flaw, it's leverage. In geopolitics, clarity reassures. Ambiguity intimidates. By keeping consequences extreme and conditions unclear, Donald Trump transformed a trade dispute into something far more consequential, a strategic test of alignment, compliance, and power. 3. Canada's China pivot, pragmatism or provocation. On paper, Canada's engagement with China looks almost boring, technical, measured, carefully calibrated. Ottawa hasn't framed these moves as defiance, but as economic pragmatism. Expanded access for Chinese electric vehicles, selective tariff easing, renewed momentum in agricultural exports. Even the language is cautious, a strategic partnership, not an alliance. From Canada's perspective, this isn't ideology, it's survival. As a middle power dependent on trade, diversification isn't a luxury, it's risk management. Supply chains fracture without warning. Markets can be weaponized overnight. And overdependence on any single partner carries real political and economic danger. In that context, engagement with China isn't about choosing sides. It's about keeping options open. But Donald Trump and the strategic worldview surrounding him sees the same moves very differently. In a more zero-sum framework, economic integration is no longer neutral terrain. Trade becomes influence, investment becomes access, market entry becomes leverage. What Ottawa describes as balance, Donald Trump interprets as exposure. That tension surfaced openly at Davos when Mark Carney warned that economic integration itself has become a weapon one that can be turned on partners as easily as on rivals. In an environment shaped by Donald Trump's pressure-based approach, neutrality becomes suspicious. Flexibility looks like disloyalty. So Canada isn't necessarily the antagonist here, it's the experiment. 4. Trade wars as power tools. A historical pattern history is clear about one thing. Tariffs have rarely been just about protection. Again and again, they arrive wrapped in the language of domestic defense jobs, fairness, national interest, while functioning in practice as tools of pressure, signals, not solutions. The pattern isn't new. In the 1930s, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was sold as a shield for American workers. Instead, it triggered retaliation, collapsed global trade, and deepened worldwide instability. The lesson was obvious. It just didn't last. Decades later, tariffs returned not as a last resort, but as a strategic instrument. During Donald Trump's first term, sweeping tariffs were imposed across allies and rivals alike. Publicly, Donald Trump justified them with jobs, fairness, and national security. In practice, the outcome was different. Counter tariffs followed. Supply chains fractured. Uncertainty became permanent. Protection gave way to unpredictability. What matters most isn't whether tariffs can temporarily shield an industry or raise revenue. It's what they communicate. A tariff identifies a target, it redraws boundaries, it signals who remains inside the favored circle and who has been pushed out. In that sense, tariffs under Donald Trump behave less like economic policy and more like moves on a geopolitical chessboard. They force reactions without firing a shot. They compress timelines. They raise the cost of hesitation, and even when never fully enforced, they still do damage, because often the real impact doesn't come from implementation, it comes from anticipation. Seen through this lens, modern trade wars aren't policy accidents. They are deliberate strategies of coercion designed to reorder behavior in a global system that is becoming more competitive, more fragmented, and far less forgiving. 5. The economic reality. Who actually pays the price strip away the rhetoric, and the economic consequences appear quietly uneven, incremental but real. In Canada, the pressure builds first where uncertainty hurts most. Manufacturing hubs tied to the auto industry begin delaying decisions. Energy-linked regions feel reduced cross-border demand. Tourism, highly sensitive to political friction and currency volatility, shows early signs of contraction. None of this requires Donald Trump to actually impose a tariff. The damage begins in anticipation long before policy becomes law, but the costs don't stop at the border. U.S. exporters are deeply embedded in North American supply chains. When uncertainty rises, Canadian buyers hesitate. Contracts slow, orders are delayed or quietly rerouted. And once hesitation sets in, volumes fall, especially in sectors where Canada isn't just a customer, but a logistical gateway to global markets. Consumers on both sides absorb the spillover. Higher input costs ripple through production chains, either pushing prices upward or squeezing margins until something breaks. Politically, Donald Trump frames tariffs as penalties imposed on foreign governments. Economically, they behave very differently. They function as indirect taxes diffused across businesses, workers, and households that have no vote in the decision. Markets have noticed the disconnect. Investor behavior increasingly reflects skepticism, captured in what traders now call the take-o theory, the belief that extreme tariff threats from Donald Trump are eventually rolled back once economic pressure mounts. Markets respond less to declarations and more to credibility, but even temporary threats leave permanent marks. Confidence erodes faster than it rebuilds. Supply chains adapt cautiously, sometimes irreversibly. And once uncertainty becomes routine, the price is no longer paid in headlines, it's paid in slower growth, deferred investment, and opportunities quietly lost long after the threat itself fades. 6. Law, limits, and institutions under strain threats of this magnitude don't exist in a vacuum. They collide head-on with the legal architecture the United States spent decades building. Under the USMCA framework, safeguards and dispute mechanisms exist for a reason to prevent unilateral escalation between partners. Yes, the agreement includes clauses addressing engagement with so-called non-market economies, but those provisions were designed as deterrents, not automatic triggers for punishment. Their use requires interpretation and restraint. This is where Donald Trump's executive instincts collide with institutional limits. Broad tariff authorities, often justified under emergency powers, are now facing intensified legal scrutiny. A pending review by the Supreme Court of the United States raises a fundamental question. How far can Donald Trump stretch unilateral economic power before it collides with constitutional boundaries? Until that question is answered, uncertainty itself becomes part of the strategy and part of the damage. What emerges is a paradox. A rules-based order depends on predictability, reciprocity, and restraint. But when Donald Trump selectively enforces rules or bypasses them altogether, the system's credibility erodes. When exemptions become political and enforcement becomes conditional, institutions stop anchoring behavior. Norms weaken. For allies, agreements meant to guarantee stability begin to feel provisional. Temporary. For rivals, the signal is different but just as clear. Rules are tools, not commitments. The approach may deliver short-term leverage. But over time, it strains the legal scaffolding that once underwrote American economic leadership, leaving institutions visibly fatigued and increasingly fragile. Fragmentation of the global order. The confrontation with Canada doesn't exist in isolation. It fits into a widening pattern shaped by Donald Trump's pressure-first worldview. Rhetoric around Greenland, mounting tariff threats against European partners, the steady erosion of trust among long-standing allies. The logic is consistent. Economic relationships once built on predictability are now treated as conditional, reversible, subject to political mood rather than institutional commitment. For much of the post-Cold War era, integration was the organizing principle. Trade expanded. Supply chains stretched across continents. Interdependence was seen as stabilizing a force that made conflict irrational. That assumption has now flipped. Under Donald Trump, interdependence is no longer just an economic reality. It's a vulnerability and therefore a weapon. In this environment, power isn't exercised by building institutions. It's exercised by exploiting choke points, access to markets, control over logistics, leverage over financial systems. Rules matter less than exposure. The result is fragmentation, parallel supply chains, redundant systems, higher costs willingly absorbed in exchange for perceived security. Middle powers feel this pressure most acutely. Countries like Canada aren't large enough to dictate terms, yet too integrated to remain neutral. Strategic autonomy narrows as alignment becomes a demand, not a choice. Those who resist aren't necessarily isolated, but they are exposed. This marks the end of an era defined by shared rules and mutual restraint. What replaces it is still forming. But one trend is unmistakable. Economic power is now exercised with fewer guardrails and far higher stakes. If we return to the opening question, one reality is now unmistakable. This was never only about Canada, and it was never just about China. What's unfolding is a transformation in how Donald Trump exercises power, not through stability, but through uncertainty. Not by reinforcing frameworks, but by keeping partners permanently off balance. In the short term, that strategy can work. It extracts concessions, it forces alignment, it reminds allies who controls access. But the costs compound. When Donald Trump replaces rules with threats and clarity with ambiguity, confidence drains from the system. Markets hesitate, allies hedge, institutions weaken. What looks like strength in the moment quietly erodes the foundations that once made American economic leadership durable. The deeper consequence is normalization. Once allies are treated like adversaries, trust is no longer assumed. It must be renegotiated constantly if it survives at all. Cooperation becomes conditional. Stability becomes fragile. And the global economy doesn't fracture in a single dramatic collapse. It fragments slowly through repeated signals that rules are optional and relationships are temporary. Each episode leaves behind doubt that never fully disappears. That may be the most unsettling outcome of all. In a world where Donald Trump wields economic power through uncertainty, everyone pays a price, even those who believe they're in control. Stability, once taken for granted, becomes the rarest currency of the emerging global order.